Again, I'm Olatunji Ojo from History Department, Brock University in St. Catharines, Canada. My main research is on slavery, 19th century, West Africa. Basically, I began with the abolition of the slave trade by Britain and the impact for Western Nigeria. And my findings are basically it's that the abolition by Britain, rather than lead to the end of slavery, indeed increased the intensity of slavery. It did in the sense that the end of slavery by Europeans led to what they called legitimate commerce in Africa. And to the extent that labor was largely not available, so West Africans took to slavery as a means of recruiting slaves. I also found in my research that the bulk of the slaves retained, at least in my area, were women and children. And to the extent that for the women, they took them not only as farm workers, but also as wives. Therefore, even when slavery was said to have ended by the British in the late 19th century, it's continued for longer period because those women, having married their so-called husbands, they couldn't leave, they couldn't file for divorce because for them to leave would have meant they had to abandon their children. Therefore, in a series of ways, women and children got caught in the discourse to abolish the slave trade. And I think that's what leads to my paper for the conference on forced marriages, whereby women simply had very little power to influence who to marry, when to marry, and indeed how people define marriage. For the conference, I think one of the most surprising findings for me was how women turned or reversed institutions that hitherto were used to keep them in bondage against the beneficiaries of that same institution. For instance, in my essay for the conference, I argued that for a very long time, young men simply carrying razors or knives or blades, simply go around the streets and attacking girls by cutting off their hair. And the implication is when a man cuts your hair or shaves off your hair, the lady is banned to marry the attacker. She can't file for divorce. She's punished when she decides to run away. But what happened after 1930 was that girls were beginning to arrange with their own boyfriends to shave their hair. And by that, used that tactic to basically decide who to marry themselves. So they took the means of marriage away from their parents, away from very powerful chiefs, and used, again, like I said, the same institution that local chiefs used for a very long period to keep girls in bondage. Those young girls flipped the traditional rant and used it against their attackers. What it does, it's two things, a couple of things. One, it shows that there's nothing normal in marriage. That marriage is not only an institution, it's also a process. So it's difficult to define marriage. What is marriage to Mr. A, it's not marriage to Mr. B. What is forced to Mr. A, it's voluntary to Mr. B. In my findings, for instance, when the colonial authorities described those assaults, the shaving of hair, as attacks, as assaults on women, the guest went to court and said, no, I've not been attacked. Indeed, I called for it because it gave me the power to influence or to pick my own boyfriend or to pick my own lovers. Yeah. So it's a very complex thing. It shows that marriage is very difficult to define. It's situational. It varies from one part of the country to another. It's generational. It's gendered. It's also class-based. Rich versus poor and that kind of a thing.